Okay, so now that we've done this, let's create some ID render passes, which we can use in Photoshop later. So let's disable this and let's make a copy of our environment layer. Let's move that to the top, disable the previous one, and we'll call this ID_1. Let's go back in our shaders, and I'm going to create a new material map, and let's call this ID_object. And I'll show you a couple of different ways to create these IDs and my reasons for using the method that I usually do. So now that we've created this, let's create a new texture, utility, and if we select, let's call this ID object matte, just so it's not confusing. Here for the color, let's select this utility. And if we go to our layer, let's just deselect the shading layer so it's less confusing, and let's override the material with our ID object map. So back to shaders, let's look at utility. You get a lot of different output choices here, and you can select object ID. And so this gives us a different color for every object in our scene, and this makes it easy to select everything separately later on. And it's a really quick way to do it. Let's call this utility_object_ID. So this is pretty good, and if you don't have too many different objects in your scene, or you're not working on a big project, I think this works well. But I think personally I prefer to do things slightly more manually, but in a way that ends up working better for me, and I will explain as I go along, and hopefully it will make sense once we're in Photoshop and painting. So let's instead create a new material matte, and we're going to call this R_matte, and let's copy it twice, and we'll call this B matte and G matte. Okay, and in our shading layers, let's create a new shading layer, and we're going to call this ID_1, actually _SL. And here we're going to create 4 rules, the bottom one being everything, and we want everything to be shaders, we want everything to be black. And actually, let me just select this black and RGB, and I'll just contextualize them, and I'll call these RGB mattes. This will make it slightly less messy. Okay. And so let's go into our layer 3D here. And let me turn off the override material. You can keep this layer if you would like to keep this method of doing it. That's absolutely fine. But I'll get rid of it. And I will change the shading layer to my ID1 shading layer here. So at the minute everything is black. But for my other materials, let's select G, B, R. Okay. And now, if here I type in tree, here I will type in balcony, and here I will type in shanty. And let's just go back to these and actually set the colors for these. So for R, we want red. For G, we want green. And for B, we want blue. Okay, so first of all, why is R not working? Let us check. If I replace the T with capital T. No. Okay, let's have a look actually inside of our city scatterers. Oh, okay. It's because for my tree scatterers, I actually called them veg in my original project for vegetation. So if I replace this with veg, boom, that works. So now we have all the trees red and all of the balconies blue and all of the shanties green. So these will be extremely simple to select in Photoshop by selecting either the R, the G, or the B channels. So what we can do now is, and this takes a little bit of time to set up, but it's worth it. We can just copy our ID1 shading layer, and we'll call this ID2 shading layer. And we can copy the ID here, and we'll call this ID2, and change the shading layer to ID2 shading layer. And so for example now, we can change this to water. We can change this to temple. We can change this to pier. And so now we have these three. And so now we have two ID layers that work perfectly fine. So, oh, oops, actually, my bad. I changed it in the ID1. So, actually, it's my ID2 that I kept the original in. My bad, but same idea. Let's copy this again. I'll call this ID3. Let's disable these. ID3 here. Let's go into this. Always make sure that this is the correct shading layer that you want, and don't make the mistake that I just did. I guess you can learn from my mistakes instead of having to make your own. Perfect. So, in addition to just individual objects having IDs created for them, we could, for example, also do select these actual folders. So I could say, for example, for R, I could say screen left underscore FG tower. Yep. So here, let's change this to ID3. And then here we could select screen left underscore midground tower, or screen right FG tower. So now we have these entire towers selected. So whenever we want to grade something in Photoshop or paint something just with the selection of one of these towers, we can do so very easily by just selecting these channels. And so here I've made 3 of these as an example, but in my project I had maybe 9 or 10 of these. So feel free to make as many as you need. I would recommend making an ID layer to include every single different type of object that is within your scene, you can never have enough. It'll always be useful, and in fact, while working, I sometimes forget to have some of them, and I have to go back and re-render some new ones because I always find that I require them at some point, and it's much better than having to cut something out by yourself. So in addition to this, another great thing to do is to create another render layer. Let's just duplicate this one and let's call it normal. And let's go to our shaders, and actually, yeah, within the RGB mats as well, let's create a new material mat, and we're going to call this normal mat. And here, let's create a texture triplanar. And here, we don't have to create a shading layer because this one material will suffice for everything, so we can just override material, normal mat, into color. And so this gives us a normal map. Well, not a normal map. This gives us a triplanar map with a different color assigned to every side. So as you can see, everything that is, I guess, right is red. Everything that's left is cyan, top green, bottom pink. So this is also very useful when, for example, you want to select all of the top surfaces or all of the, I guess, surfaces facing in X or Z. But let's simplify this a little bit, and the reason I call this the normal is because I only want the RGB or the XYZ. So right and left, let's keep these the same. So both red, top and bottom, and let's keep these both green, and front and back, let's keep these both blue. Okay, so now we just have RGB. And again, in Photoshop, when we go into the channels, we can just select the R, the G, and the B channels separately, and this will make it very convenient because that way you can select these colors perfectly. So actually we could call this even normal underscore ID because this will serve the same purpose for us, right? So that is quite good to have. And as a matter of fact, in addition, currently our object space is set to object base. So this will be giving us the normals for every object despite their orientation. So for example, if we rotate something 90 degrees, this will not account for that and just project these colors on the object itself. So for example, here we have this arch and this wall both facing the same way, but this is red and this is blue. This is because originally this arch was rotated the same way as this, and when we rotated it, it kept the red color because it's set to the object base, so that ignores the transformations applied to each object. So this is quite useful, but I think maybe we instead want to have object space set to world. So now this accounts for all of those rotations, and everything is equally shaded based on the world space orientation in X or Z or Y. So I think that's a slightly better option, but if you want, you can keep both. It's sometimes nice to have the variety when you're working in Photoshop later on. Okay, so I believe this is enough for IDs. In the next tutorial, we are going to look at creating some textures in Photoshop, and then creating triplanar texture projections in Clarice, which will then help us later on when painting our matte painting in Photoshop. Okay, cool.